Hi, I'm Don Deal. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Norm Geisler International Ministries. Welcome to the third day of the third International Apologetics Marathon here at the Trinity channel. If you were expecting to watch a debate tonight, I apologize. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Anjum Chowdhury won't be able to join David Wood in the debate tonight. So what we've done, we've moved up the slots a little bit. So right now, we're going to be discussing the topic of women in Islam. Tonight we have a group of excellent speakers. First, I would like to introduce Beth Grove. Beth was born and raised in the mission field and has lived among Muslim immigrant communities in London for 18 years, enjoying friendship and dialogue with Muslim friends from many nations. After traveling through Muslim countries, she obtained a master's degree in Islamics and is one of the co-founders of the Pfander Center for Apologetics, which is a research think tank and teaching ministry to equip Christians worldwide to engage Islam with a confident Christianity. Joining us from London now is Beth Grove. Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Next we have Dianna Newman. Dianna holds a BS and a Bachelor of Science and Honors with a double major in Psychology and Sociology from the University of Toronto and a Master of Arts from Southern Evangelical Seminary in Apologetics and Philosophy. She's a member of Southern Evangelical's team, that's Truth Evangelism Apologetics Mission, and is a member of the speaking team of the International Society of Women in Apologetics. Beth, welcome to the show.
Hi, Don. It's good to hear from you.
Thank you. It's good to hear from you, too. Glad to have you on here with us. Next, we have Cindi Suffern. Cindi holds a BA from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a certificate in teaching English as a second language from Duke University, and an MA in Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Cindi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
And finally, our final guest is the inestimable David Wood. David has been debating Muslims and teaching about Islam in churches and conferences for many years now. David, welcome to the show.
Yeah, how's it going there, Don?
So
I wanted to be seeing Anjum right now, but I'm sorry. I have to see you, so it's okay. It's okay.
I realize that some people are more attractive to look at than others, but I'll do the best I can. The traditional view. There's been many different ways you've heard women discussed in Islam. If you listen to some speakers, particularly Muslims or Muslim apologists, you'll hear a story such as this, and I'm going to read this directly from a Muslim apologetics website. At a time when female children were buried alive in Arabia and women were considered transferable property, Islam honored women in society by elevating them and protecting them with unprecedented rights. Islam gave women the right to education, to marry someone of their choice, to retain their identity after marriage, to divorce, to work, to own and sell property, to seek protection by the law, to vote, and to participate in civic and political engagement. That's the traditional Muslim story, and that's what you'll hear from Muslim apologists here in the West. There's a different story perhaps to be told amongst Muslims who have grown up and lived in the Middle East and lived in Islamic societies, and we're here to discuss some of the problems with that narrative you've just heard. So what I'd like to do is get the panel engaged here by asking a few questions. I think the first question we're going to ask is, there's an essential difference between men and women. I think everyone recognizes that. The origin of men and women, evolutionary biology will tell you one thing, Islam perhaps another, Christianity, different religions tell you different things. But is there a difference in the way the Islamic story and the Christian story, the biblical story of the origin of men and women, is there a difference? Beth Grove, would you like to answer that question?
This comes up a lot in conversations with Muslims. One of the big differences is the whole idea of how God created us. If you look at Christianity, God created us in His image. And of course, Muslims don't always understand what image means. They think it means a physical image. And if you look at Islam, men and women were not created in God's image at all. And also men and women were not created to have a relationship with God, which we all have very clearly in the biblical story. And I think one of the easiest ways to help Muslims understand that there's such a big difference between the value of women and also men, of course, and also our identity, our status, and our equality, is just by unpacking that story, the story in the Bible and the story in the Quran. When you look at the biblical story, you see that God walks and talks with human beings and he creates mankind in his image, male and female. But if you look at the Quranic story, there's none of that. There's no relationship with God. There's the idea that Allah is communicating with them somehow in the garden, but Muslims say he's not talking the way we talk. But if you look at the biblical story, all the way through the Bible, from the beginning, from Genesis right through to Revelation, God walks and talks with us. And there's deep value in that. And with Muslims, that is not the case at all. And so there's a real lack of understanding of the value of men, and especially the value of women in light of that. So I think that's a real important area for Muslims to try to understand, that their God just does not put this kind of value in women as he does in man. You see that in the Surah 4:1. That's the big apologetics verse that many Muslims go to, and also Surah 33:35. And they try to show equality of women through that. And they say in Surah 4:1, the woman is also from the same sources as the man. Well, every human being believes that, and that doesn't actually show your value, because you're not actually designed and created an image of God. And that actually makes a huge difference.
Well, let's turn this over to Dianna. Dianna, do you see a difference in the creation story of men and women between the Islamic narrative and the Judeo-Christian story?
Absolutely. I would definitely echo everything that Beth has just said, but I think that kind of sheds light on why we as Christians see a fundamental error when it comes to the value of women as seen in Islamic theology. Her value, because her value is not sourced in her being a special creation, her value is not sourced in being made in the image and in the likeness of God. Her value then defaults to some type of functional value. A good Muslim woman then is someone who submits well. Someone who submits well to Allah, someone who submits well to her father, someone who submits well to her husband. In Islam, there is no intrinsic or essential value. It all comes from in how well she performs her function as woman.
What I'm hearing is two things. I'm hearing a relationship difference, and I'm hearing an image of God difference. David Wood, would you say that there's a difference in the way that Christians believe that they were created in the image of God and Muslims believe they were created by God? Would you say there's an essential difference there?
I mean, there's no question, right? I mean, it's well, I mean, from beginning to end, there are differences in Islam and Christianity and their view of human beings, both men and women. But there's something very powerful about saying that human beings, that men and women, are created in the image of God. A Muslim would look at this, and you can ask CL when he's back on here how a Muslim would view that kind of claim. According to the Quran, the best relationship that you can have with Allah is a slave to master relationship. There is no higher relationship than the slave to master relationship. But when we're told that we have the honor of being created in the image of God, that this image of God is then warped and twisted by sin, but it is nevertheless still present, well, that ties into the story of redemption and why God would do what he did to rescue us out of this world, the special status that we have that sets us apart from everything else that he's created. And when you remove that, everything else starts to unravel.
I realize a lot's already been said, but Cindi, I'd like to get you involved in this too. Do you see a difference between the image of God issue or in the relationship of God to humans in the two religions as you've studied it?
Yes, I would agree with everything that's already been said. From the creation story on, just the way in the Bible, God reveals himself in relationship to man and woman equally. From the first chapter, as we've said, saying that he's made them in the image of God, male and female equally. Then he gives them a mandate to be fruitful and multiply. And then from the story of the creation of Eve, you see this beauty of God's design and how he's created Eve to be a helpmate, to come alongside Adam And he is so amazed when he wakes up and sees this beautiful creature God's created. From my reading of the Quran, Eve is not named, and she just is mentioned there when Allah is talking to Adam about going to be a vice regent on earth, and it kind of mentions the wife. So she's kind of almost, in my mind, she's there, and she's acknowledged as being there, but almost kind of an afterthought. So I think from the very beginning of the Bible, we see this complementary two genders, both very much created, both very much designed, both in the image of God.
Well, doesn't the Bible say that women are to submit to men? Doesn't this in some way imply that men are superior to women, Cindi?
Great question. It does say in Ephesians, the Apostle Paul talks about women submitting to their husbands and respecting their husbands. He begins by saying we mutually submit to one another in the fear of Christ. And then he goes on to say women have a responsibility as they submit to their husband's leadership. And as he models the love of God for his wife. So it's a mutual give and take as the woman submits to her husband's leadership. It no way implies any kind of significance in the value of her as a woman, which is easy for women to take and kind of go down that rabbit trail. But I think fully reading what Scripture says about women, it's part of God's design, and actually is kind of a reflection of who God is and the Trinity. Actually, when you look at husband and wife, how they reflect, it says Christ in the church, but also modeling for the husband, modeling who Christ is, and his love for his wife, which I haven't seen so far in my reading of the Quran. This command to love his wife as Christ loves the church, I think, is an even higher calling for the husband than the wife has, as she submits to his leadership.
David, are women equal to men in the Bible?
It depends on what you mean, right? I mean, when it says that that man is created in the image of God, God created man in his image, then it specifically says male and female he created them. You can have different roles and still be equal in different ways, right? So, I mean, for instance, Barack Obama and I are both equal in humanity, right? We're equal in the sense that we are human beings. He's president of the United States. He is a higher authority for political leadership in the United States than I am. That doesn't mean that I'm less of a human being than I am. And you know, in Ephesians, where it says submit to one another, if I submit to you, or I submit to my leader, or I submit to my pastor, in what sense does that make me less of a human being? I think in the West, especially, we've come to take a very negative view of what it means to submit. Now, we also have to keep in mind that a Christian view of submission is very different from an Islamic view of what submission is. So we can't just use those interchangeably. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind a difference between a Christian view of submission and a sort of secular view of submission in the West, where, hey, who are you to tell me to submit? That would make me less of a human being than you are, and that's just nonsense. I mean, Jesus gives the example, right? He becomes obedient even to death, and I don't see that as, wow, now he's really bad. He's less than he could be. That's the greatest thing anyone could ever do for someone. And so what you see is throughout Scripture, you see a reciprocity. Here's what's required of this group. Here's what's required of this group. And as it was just pointed out, the calling to love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I mean, this is, you Christian men out there, you are called, if necessary, to be crucified for your wives. If it came right down to it, you would have to lay down your lives and be crucified for your wives if you wanted to love them as Christ loved the church. And it's just is a very, very different picture of what you find in Islam.
Dianna, Do women in
Yes.
Islam, are they not supposed to love their husbands and men not supposed to love their wives in Islam? Or what are we saying here?
Well, let's make a distinction between what Islam teaches and what Muslims actually do, in the very same way that we would make a distinction between what Christianity teaches and what Muslims do. And so we're not saying that by virtue of being Muslim, a woman is not able to be loved. And we're not saying by virtue of being a Muslim, a man is not able to respect. We're saying that there are passages in the Quran that don't support that idea. And so certainly we don't want to give off the impression as if Muslims can't do those things, but we're very concerned with the Quran because the Quran is prescriptive for their faith and for their practice.
Okay, I understand we've got Beth back on. Beth, do you want to jump in on this discussion of the role of men and women in Christianity? Because it's been asserted on various Muslim websites and by various Muslim scholars that there's really not a difference in the way Islam and Christianity, that both of them require the woman to submit to the husband and both of them require the man to be the leader of the family. So do you have something to say about this?
Yes, unfortunately I missed just the other discussion, but this comes up a lot in discussions with my Muslim friends and also Muslims I meet in London. And it's fascinating. They always go to the Ephesians 5 passage where it talks about submission, but they ignore their own passage, Surah 4:34, that says righteous women are devoutly obedient to a husband. And also that they're devoutly obedient to a husband who can beat them and neglect them, if you take that verse at face value. Whilst in the Bible, it's in the idea of to a loving husband, always to a loving husband. And so oftentimes they try to point fingers at the Bible, but don't realize there's a far greater problem with the Quran. And it's quite different in Islam and Christianity. One of the big apologetics that Muslims are putting out in recent years is that Islam and Christianity are the same in so many areas, including gender, although of course they say that Islam elevated the position of women, especially compared to Christianity. And I think we need to inform our Muslim friends that just is not the case.
Well, I think a Muslim would say that in the West, the Christian nations, that women have become nothing more than sex symbols, something to be lusted after by men and something to lead men into temptation and sin, and that Christianity results in a lowering of the ethical standards and moral standards. David, do you think that Christianity is responsible for the lowering of ethical and moral standards in America in relations to the treatment of women?
If you look around, notice there is a correspondence not between taking Christianity seriously and the lowering of the value of women and the degrading of women. There's a correspondence between taking Christianity less and less seriously and lowering a view of women to just things to pleasure ourselves with. So it's not like as Christianity grows and increases and spreads that women are treated worse. It's the exact opposite. It's in recent decades as Christianity has been pushed more and more into a completely private sector. That's what you do in your own home, but keep don't talk about it. We don't want to hear about it. That's when you see the recent changes. And so I think the only thing that Muslims can actually say, and I think this is the Muslim view, is Christianity won't control you, right? If you look to the New Testament, the most severe punishment that the church would inflict is, there's the door, ladies and gentlemen. If you don't want to follow Christ's teachings, there's the door, right? Don't be part of the fellowship if you don't want to obey Christ. There is no killing and slaughtering, and so what you find in Scripture is, if you don't want to follow the commands, don't follow the commands. And I think Muslims could say, well, look at the effect that has on society. If Christians aren't going to go out and control women, well, then women are just going to run wild and so on. And true, we're not going to run around killing men for lusting after women. We're not going to run around killing women for going outside with a skirt on or something like that. And so there are Muslims who will look down upon Christianity for not being political enough. But that's an Islamic ideal, not a Christian ideal. If people do not want to follow Christ's teachings, we do not force them.
Cindi, the idea of Islamic law regulating all aspects of life such that it protects women and elevates women, whereas Christianity has no such corollary. Do you see that as being a factor in this?
I do, because when you were talking about submission just a few minutes ago, I was kind of reflecting on this idea of submission in Christianity versus submission in Islam. In Christianity, this is a heart choice that is done by the woman, and the husband and wife both submitting to God, the woman submitting to the godly leadership of her husband, something that she's not forced to do. And in contrast to that,
Okay, looks like we're having a technical difficulty with Cindi, so I'm going to turn that question to Dianna. Dianna, do you see a problem with the fact that Islamic law has what's called the hudud ordinances, the laws that prescribe punishment for certain activity, stoning adulterers, etc., and you simply don't see porno theaters in the Middle East. You simply don't see prostitutes out on the street in the Middle East like you do in many Christian countries in the West. Do you think that has something to do with the difference in the value of women and difference in the view of women in Islam and Christianity?
Sure, and I think it points to a much larger distinction to be made between Christianity and Islam, and it has everything to do with our theology. In Christianity, our process of sanctification has something to do with a heart change. That what happened in the garden seriously tarnished man's relationship with God. And so this created the need for a redeemer, which we understand to be Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, he comes to change hearts. And on the basis of a changed heart, the Christian then acts. In Islam, that is not the case, which is why there's such an emphasis for laws. Do this, do it this way, do it this many times, do not do this. It's a clear distinction between the love that grounds God's dealing with us as humans, and the distinction between that and the way Allah deals with his people, which is through law. And there is no such thing as grace.
It sounds like the theme of that great musical Les Miserables, where Jean Valjean sings, "Once a thief, always a thief." That is, the law doesn't have the power to change, whereas grace does. Beth, does the law have the power to change people's hearts?
No, it doesn't. In fact, the Bible says that very clearly over and over again. And where Muslims have gone wrong is that they have taken us back to an Old Testament type law, although of course added a lot more than the Old Testament. They've taken us back to before Christ. They've taken us back under the law. And yet they haven't realized what the law is. So take, for example, their cleansing laws. Before they pray, they have to cleanse themselves. And that's very important to a Muslim. Or when any bodily emission comes out, a Muslim has to cleanse themselves, including in the most intimate places of marriage. They have to then go and cleanse themselves. And so with Muslims, they've borrowed these laws, some of which were ceremonial laws and Old Testament laws, and haven't understood what the law was all about. And that was to point that no human being could actually ever complete God's law. And so they've borrowed it and they've put all these external laws on, not understood the heart of the law, and that it actually points to their sin, and it points to the fact they will never complete law according to the Old Testament and law according to Islam. And so for them, they're left wanting. And their Islam does not provide a solution for the inward struggle and sin and darkness that is in every person's heart. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with Islam.
Cindi, what was the purpose of the law in the Old Testament? Wasn't it to regulate people's lives and make them acceptable before God?
Well, I think it was to show them how to live in relationship with God, but I think a bigger idea behind the law is to show them that they couldn't follow the law. It was actually to show them this is what a holy God demands of you, and you follow the law to have sins atoned for, especially once a year when that lamb is sacrificed on your behalf. It's a visual picture doing this law over and over and over for years for them, to see that this was necessary to, and how far they were from living a holy life. But and show them their need and how incomplete the law was. So I think it's the Old Testament to me is a very big picture of the need for Christ coming and showing us that we need a changed heart and that only He can do it. And He's the one who transforms our hearts and our minds.
Okay, excellent answer. Well, we're going to get David Wood here involved, but we're going to take a break first to give David a little bit more time to think about what he's going to say. So we're going to take a short break here. Remember, this is the third day of the Trinity Channel's Apologetics Marathon. Please consider supporting this ministry.
We're going to continue with our show today, and that's Women in Islam. We're going to turn it back over to our host, Don Deal.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Don Deal, the Director of Research and Development for Norm Geisler International Ministries. We're here on the third day of the Trinity Channel's International Apologetics Marathon, and you're joining us for the Women in Islam show. During the break, I was speaking with David Wood about some of these issues of law and obedience in Islam versus Christianity, and I think the audience would get would really be helpful and learn from hearing this. David, what are your thoughts on what we've been discussing here amongst Cindi and Beth and Dianna and I?
Well, a lot of these issues tie together, and especially you were talking about morality and you know how Muslims would view what goes on here, and do they have a point? But also, you know, the Old Testament and law and so on, and really this is one of the most important issues, and it's a couple issues actually combined. But this is one of the most important things you could ever understand as a Christian. Two, that you could help your Muslim friends to understand. There are two ways to be immoral. There's obviously, you know, lots of ways to be immoral, but I'm talking about two broad ways to be immoral, because morality, true morality, is not just doing the right thing. It's doing the right thing for the right reason or with the right intention. Let me give you an example. If I'm walking down the street and I find, let's say, a purse with, you know, someone's money in it, I can do the wrong thing right there, right? One way I could do the wrong thing is for me to keep the purse and go spend the money. That would be wrong. It's not my money. I would be taking it. But there's another way where I wouldn't be doing the right thing. I wouldn't be moral, right? And that is, if I'm about to take the money, but I look over and I see a police officer who's ready to arrest me, and so I say, "Oh, here, officer, take this purse that I just found." Notice, I'm doing the right thing. But suppose I would have stolen the money if the police officer hadn't been standing there. Well, I'm not any more moral than if I had just taken the money, right? Even though in one situation I did the wrong thing, I took the money. In this situation, I do the right thing. I give the money to the police officer, but not because I wanted to. I did it because there's a police officer standing there and he's going to arrest me. So notice, in neither situation have I done the right thing. I haven't done the right thing if I take the money, and I haven't done the right thing if I give the money back, but only because I'm going to get in trouble if I don't. The only way to really do the right thing here is to do it with the right intention, right? Give it back because it's the right thing to do. Now, this applies to, I would say, Islam and Christianity and sort of Western secularism. If you look at Islam, Islam looks at what's going on in the West, right? They look and they see moral decay, and they say, you see, the West needs Sharia. Anjem Chowdhury will say, you need Sharia. You need Islam to come in here and save you guys, to rescue you guys from immorality. Otherwise, it's just going to be nonstop decay. And some people in the West who convert to Islam do so with that as their motive, right? It's, oh, look at all the immorality. I need something to rescue me. Now, think about how ridiculous that is, right? You don't need Islam in order to dress a certain way or to do certain things. So the real thrust behind Anjem's point is Islam will force you to do stuff, right? Because Islam will kill you if you don't. Islam will give you lashes if you don't do what they say. Islam will enforce all kinds of punishments. But think about this, right? You have people in Iraq right now, and you have ISIS moving in, and you have Sunnis and Shias and people that didn't want to do what ISIS is telling them to do. If ISIS then makes them do something with the threat of death if they don't do it, Are these people somehow more moral? Are they better people? No. If just because they're dressing a certain way because they're terrified of ISIS killing them or something like this, doesn't make them more moral. And so what you have kind of two extremes. One would be total lawlessness and do whatever you feel like doing, no matter how wrong it is. And there are people who support that kind of view. The other extreme, the opposite extreme, would be do what you're told to do, but only because you are scared of being punished for it. Well, that's not any more, I don't see how one is any more moral than the other. In other words, if you look at the Middle East and women are dressed much more modestly, if they're only doing that because they're scared of being punished, that's not any more moral than, women walking around naked. So what you need in order to have genuine morality is to do the right thing for the right reason, from the right intention. And you find that in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, but you do not find it in Islam. What do I mean here? In the Old Testament, notice, obedience follows. It comes after redemption. God rescues them, and then because he has rescued them, he has given them the promised land. He says, now, here are the rules you need to follow. You are doing that out of love and gratitude for the God who has already rescued you. And so, yes, there are punishments and so on, but the thrust of why you're supposed to be doing what you're doing is because this is the God who rescued you out of slavery and gave you a much better life. Now, out of love and gratitude, do what he says. What do we find in the New Testament? Jesus died on the cross for your sins. He entered creation to suffer the punishment that you deserve. You do what he says out of love and gratitude. Notice you're doing the right thing, not because he's going to zap you or someone's going to give you lashes or something if you don't, but because you love God. That's the thrust of morality. You can still have punishments in the Old Testament. You can still have punishments today for the government, for murder and stealing things and so on. But if we were to say, why are you as a Christian supposed to obey God? It's because he loved you first and redeemed you first. Compare that to Islam, where according to the Quran, chapter 3, verse 32, God has no love for unbelievers. If you look throughout the Quran, you find over and over again, like a beating drum, God doesn't love these people, God doesn't love those people, God doesn't love the proud, God doesn't love the mischief makers. So what you find is you obey first, and then Allah will save you if he chooses. And so you are obeying out of fear of hell, right? He's going to punish you, and because you want your virgins in paradise, right? So what kind of obedience is this, right? If I help an old lady cross the street because I believe she's created in the image of God and I should help this person, I've done the right thing. If I do it because I believe I'm going to get virgins in paradise, what am I doing? What am I doing wrong? I mean, what am I doing that's right here? And so you find out of all the worldviews, they all go to an extreme, but it's Christianity that has you doing the right thing for the right reason. And yes, Muslims in a Muslim country would be able to enforce certain things that we do not enforce, but if they think that would make it better, I would beg to differ.
Well, let me ask you one more question, David. For an exemplar of how to best show a marriage relationship or the relationship of men and women, does the Quran tell Muslims who to use as the example there?
I mean, as far, I mean, your example for really any sort of conduct would be Muhammad, right? He is the pattern of conduct. That's chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran, that Muhammad is the pattern of conduct that you are supposed to follow. But this is a guy, I mean, he hit his own wife, Aisha. She snuck out of the house to see what he was doing. He hit her in her chest. He told his followers it's okay to beat their wives into submission. I mean, really, I don't know if you want to get into this, but I can go down the list of Muhammad's example, his moral example.
Well, let me ask Beth on this one. Beth, are there examples in the Muhammad's life that show Muslims how they're supposed to conduct marital relations?
Absolutely, and actually most Muslims don't realize these stories exist. So for example, if you read Ibn Ishaq or Al-Waqidi, some of the earliest biographers of Muhammad, and Muslims always refer to the biographies, but they never have read them for themselves on the whole. And when you actually open the biographies and you let them read the stories for themselves, a lot of Muslims are shocked by the example they find there. I like to compare Khadija, the first wife, who really represents the pre-Islamic woman, the woman who had free freedoms, the woman who was wealthy, the woman who was able to make her decisions, and who actually Muhammad had to look up to. She was his boss. And then when Islam came into play, and you start to see how he treated his other wives after Khadija died, for example, how he obtained some of his wives, the stories are quite disturbing. You have very sad stories of Safia, Juraira, you have the Coptic Maryam, you have these girls, Rehana and Maryam were two girls who refused to convert, and as a result they were kept as concubines, which in essence is actually a sex slave, which is very sad. And of course we see ISIS doing this right now. You have Safia, and there's a very sad story with Safia where her husband was tortured. And then Muhammad killed all of her male family members, and then took her for himself. She was very beautiful. Most of his wives were young and very beautiful, and he took them for himself, sometimes killing their husbands in the process, and then afterwards taking them for himself or distributing them among his men. Sometimes there was quarrels between a woman that the men had caught in a time of war. There's one very sad story. Al-Waqidi really unpacks this, and it's a story of a young girl. They call her running like a gazelle, and she's looking behind her and she's afraid, and she says, where's my protector, where's my protector? And one of the Muhammad's men comes along, and he's killed the man. He has the man's sword, and he says, is this his sword? And she then, it just says, she resigns herself. Basically she resigns herself to her fate. And then the men start debating who's going to have her, and they complain, and then Muhammad gives her to one man when she's already been given to another. And there's always these big debates and around these gorgeous young girls that they have been enslaving. And so the example of Muhammad is quite heinous. It's quite disturbing when you read the biographies. And what is troubling, some Muslims want to deny those sources. They want to throw the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, out. They want to throw out the Sirat Rasulullah, the surah, the sirah or biography of Muhammad. But the problem is the Quran says over and over again that in Muhammad you have an example to follow, or it says what Allah and Muhammad have decreed, we have no choice in the matter. We see that in Surah 33. And over it says Muhammad is the example for mankind. And what is really disturbing, especially from a Christian point of view, is when you compare it with the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's where the big crunch comes. It was interesting, just this past Sunday I was talking to a Muslim man, and he said to me, Muhammad is the seal of all prophets. And I said to him, that's interesting. Let me tell you why I don't believe that's the case. Just comparing with Jesus Christ. Muhammad was going to marry a girl and found out she had leprosy. He then did not marry her in the end. What would Jesus have done with a girl like that? He would have healed her, as he did in the New Testament. He healed the lepers. Muhammad killed and stoned and whipped the adulteresses. What did Jesus do? He forgave the woman weeping at his feet. Even though she was a sinful woman, he talked to the Samaritan woman as if she was an equal. And actually, she became the first evangelist in John 4. And I went through all these different things that Muhammad did in comparison to Jesus. And in the end, the man just looked at me and goes, Muhammad is the seal of all prophets. And I said, but you're not weighing up the data. Weigh up the data. Compare Jesus and Muhammad. Muhammad cannot be a prophet and cannot be the seal of prophets, especially when you compare it to Jesus Christ.
Well, I got a follow-up question for you here, Beth. Muhammad's adopted son Zaid, wasn't there a verse revealed in the Quran that specifically applied to his wife?
Yes, and oftentimes Muhammad kept receiving convenient revelations. That is one verse where it talks about Muhammad sees Zaid, Zainab. She's young, she's pretty, and of course Allah works it for him so that her husband decides he doesn't want to be married to her anymore, and he doesn't desire her, and then of course she then can be divorced, and then Muhammad is free to marry her. There's many convenient revelations like that. For example, Surah 33:53, you have basically how Muhammad lived in his household. This is from the Quran itself. So maybe, say, progressive modernist Muslims might throw out the Sirah, they might throw out the Hadith, they might throw out all the traditions of Islam. They can't throw out the Quran. And in Surah 33:53, it talks about how you are to behave when you go into Muhammad's house. So you go into his house, you have to first of all talk, you have to be invited, and then you can't stay long. You have to leave very quickly, and you have to talk to his wives from behind a screen. And then it says, Allah tells you this because Muhammad is shy. And it says, Allah tells you this because Muhammad gets annoyed. I'm paraphrasing there. But basically, you can see that the whole way that Muhammad uses revelation for his own gain to marry his adopted son's wife, and also to be able to basically not be hospitable because he gets easily annoyed. And even very sad verses like in Surah 4, where it talks about the slave girls, what your right hand possesses. So for example, it says you cannot marry married women. I think that's Surah 4:24, but you can accept what your right hand possesses. So you are actually allowed to marry married women if they're your slave girls. And I always say to Muslims, and I say to my dear friends, some of whom are thinking of converting to Islam, or some who are already Muslims, and I say to them, you know, Muhammad and the Quran, Allah, the God of Islam, actually does not protect people like me. So if Islam came to power in Britain, if I was married, I'm not, but say I was married, I would not be protected. It means that Muslims could, if they wanted to, even though I'm married, they could marry me. And that is just absolutely immoral. That comes straight from the mouth of Allah, according to the Quran.
Wow. Dianna, you have something to say on this matter?
Yeah, I mean, Surah 4 would be the surah that everyone who is listening should really take a look at and really investigate these things that we're saying. There's Surah 4 talks about wives being a tilth for their husband, that he can go into her as he will. And sometimes you'll hear Muslims speaking about this verse and attempting to esteem the virtues of being a tilth, which is ultimately just a fertile piece of land. But at the end of the day, land is only valuable because it performs a certain function. Certainly in their society, no one esteemed land just because it was land. Land was valuable because it produced something. And so the very fact that women are compared to a property that is able to produce something just goes back to what we're talking about here in terms of value. And the essential differences between Christianity have to be traced to this idea that woman is not made in the image and likeness of God. It just keeps coming back over and over.
Cindi, we seem to be discussing here an essentialist view of women and men versus a functionalist view of women and men. That is, are men and women essentially made in the image of God and therefore valuable in and of themselves, or is it due to the role they play and their function within society? How do you see the difference between Islam and Christianity in this respect?
I think you're right. I think if you look at the what the Bible says versus what the Quran says, and the example of Muhammad between men and women, as we've talked about earlier, the fundamental idea of men and women in the Bible, and early in Genesis, saying they're made in the image of God, that they're both, and then in the New Testament, saying there's no male or female. We're all one in Jesus Christ. So there's a real unity as far as our humanity, our equal worth before God. And Peter, he talks about us being co-equal heirs, the husband and the wife. So I think there's very much an essentialist view in the Bible. I see, when I read the Quran, I don't see that kind of, I think it goes back, unfortunately, to kind of the 7th century idea that that Islam grew out of, that women were, we saw in Khadijah the example that Beth gave, how she had freedom. She was a businesswoman, but then when the law came, as understood through Muhammad and his revelations, then women have a more of a functional view. This is how they need to relate to men, that they are more of to be obedient in every situation, and that their treatment reflects so much on the honor of the man. And I think one thing we haven't talked about is really just the idea of honor, and how the woman is responsible really for kind of carrying the honor of the family. and the kind of, if you can control the woman, especially through any kind of sexuality, anything having to do with that part of her, is a real kind of functionalist view, I think. But it reflects, she carries that burden to reflect the honor of the family, and so she's looked on as one who can be taken and as a wife or treated however the husband feels like he needs to, if they're having a hard time, a bad relationship. And so I don't think that this kind of, I think you're right. I think this functionalist view is very strong in Islam, because it's how she functions as a woman, actually, if I could put it that way, really reflects on the honor of her husband, on the honor of her father and her brothers, and then her husband, and then her son. And so she is this, why she is so, her position is so defined, and her choices in life, when Sharia law is strictly enforced, that really limit her choices in life.
We're going to take a break now. This has been Women in Islam on the Trinity Channel. Today's the third day of the International Apologetics Marathon.
And I hand it back over to my brother, Don Deal, who's hosting the show.
Hi, welcome back to the Women in Islam show here on the third day of the Trinity Channel's International Apologetics Marathon. We're here with Cindi Suffern, with Dianna Newman, with Beth Graves, and David Wood discussing the position of women in Islam. Let me go back to Beth for just a moment. Beth, how can you say that women don't have the same status in Islam as they do in men, and that there's a different view based on the relationship with God, when it clearly says whoever performs the best deeds, that's the best Muslim? It doesn't say whichever man, it says whoever. How can you say that some way, doesn't that in some way at least imply, at the very least, that women are equal to men?
Certainly towards the end of, according to Muslim tradition, the revelation of Muhammad, women were beginning to be included into the Quran. It's interesting, when you look at the history of the Quran according to the traditions of Islam, you will read some interesting hadith out there where you have the women approach Muhammad and they start complaining. They say, "Oh Muhammad, why is it that Allah does not address women in the Quran?" And in fact, some very modernist feminist Muslims admit that when you first open the Quran, it seems to be very pro-male, and much of it seems to be directing itself just to men. However, some of the modernists try to say is that whenever the Quran talks about mankind in general, it's including both male and female. My response to that is, certainly towards the end of the Quran, there seems to be men and women are included. Surah 33:35, the big equality verse that Muslims all go to, where it refers to men and women all the way through, pious men and women, obedient men and women, and then you will receive a reward. Certainly that's addressed to all. And I say, yes, in judgment, men and women do seem to be equal before Allah. In reward, possibly not, because when you look at the reward they're going to receive is maidens, heavenly maidens. Most women I know are not really wanting heavenly maidens for all eternity. And so when you look at the rewards, it's very pro-male, but also what you find is that it came, those revelation, and it says the context of revelation, in Arabic we say asbab al-nuzul, and that context of revelation of Surah 33:35 came after the women complained to Muhammad, "Oh Muhammad, why are we not being included in the revelation?" Then Allah began to send down these different revelations, which also included the women. So maybe in judgment, women are equal. But when it comes to the status in life, so a woman as a mother, a woman as a daughter, and a woman as a wife, which are the three ways that women are looked at in Islam, if you look at the whole story of the Quran. Interesting, never a woman just as a woman who can serve God, a woman who is free to do mighty things for God, as the Bible says so. And you find that when you look at life, the status of a woman in life, then she is far less than a man. What is also interesting, I say this to my lovely Muslim friends, I say to them that and I remember talking to a young girl who had just converted to Islam, and I said this to her. I said to her, ultimately, what is your end goal? Why do you convert to Islam? And so she came up with all the romanticized views that she's been taught about how Muhammad treated women, which I think we've shown clearly is not actually very positive tonight. And also, she talked about just learning the rules and the things that she needed to learn. And I said to her, what's the end goal of your religion? What happens at the end? And she goes, well, actually, I haven't studied that yet. And I said to her, that's interesting. You converted to a religion where you're not sure what the end goal is, the end game. And I said a number of things. First of all, when you go into paradise, the Muslim paradise, according to the Quran and Muslim tradition, you're going to watch your husband sleep with a plethora of women, incredibly, I'm not even going to describe them, but the way it's described in the hadith is use your imagination. It's pretty pornographic. And it's basically eternal orgy. And I said, however, some people say that you may get two husbands. That's maybe in a hadith, but that's not really emphasized when you look at the descriptions of paradise. But there's one really important thing that you're going to miss. You converted to a religion where you will never, ever be with Allah. The men are going to go into paradise. The men are going to get their rewards according to Islamic theology. The men, with the first 10,000, will see Allah on the last day. But the ones who are going to really be in paradise are really men. The majority of women are hell if you take the traditions. The majority of people in hell are women if you take the traditions seriously. And she had no answer to that. And I just said to her, in the Islamic paradise, God is not there. In the Islamic hell, most women are there. And when they asked Muhammad why this was the case, he said because they are ungrateful to the husbands. Also because they are deficient in their intelligence, because it takes two women to, that's equivalent of one man in a court of law, the testimony of a woman. And it says they are deficient in their religion, because when a woman menstruates, she's not able to pray. She's not able to enter the presence of God. So in our status in life, in our most needy of times, we're not able to pray. And so all of those things add up and show that in life, women just are not equal with men. And in paradise, in fact, most of us are not going to get there, according to the Muslim traditions, and most of us are going to go to hell. And when you look at the rewards given to Muslims, it really is a pro-male, carnal, very sexual, very immoral paradise.
Well, Dianna, are women equal to men in intelligence?
I think so. I think that, that's an interesting question. I know that we're joking. But very clearly, if we want to take a look at cognitive processing and power and those sorts of things, even just from a psychological perspective, there's really no empirical data out there that we should even use to suggest that women are deficient in intelligence. That's just not true.
So are you saying that Islamic tradition is incorrect in that matter?
I'm saying Islamic tradition is definitely incorrect in that matter.
Does anybody disagree with Dianna? I didn't think so. Let's get on one other topic before we don't have that much time left, but I would like to discuss a little bit the topic of honor killings. We see it's happening some in the U.S. and in the West and frequently in the Middle East. Daughters, wives are killed by the patriarch of the family because they brought dishonor on the family. Is that cultural or is that Islamic? Cindi, have you studied this?
A little bit. And unfortunately, we just hear about it more in the news, more and more. I think it's, as we were talking earlier, how it's tied to the idea of women and the idea of women upholding the honor of the family. If the rules for women where Sharia law is in Muslim majority countries is so enforced, and even in other countries where families are very much trying to live under Sharia law, there's this the pressure for the woman, whether she's how she's dressed, whether she's veiled properly, whether she so many rules about whether she talks to men, looks at men, her modesty, her behavior, everything about her, her context. And so it's such a strong tie to the reflection on the family itself that unfortunately this is an event that we hear about way too often in kind of Muslim context, and I think it just comes out of unfortunately, I think, a view of women that is deficient in the Quran and the Hadith, but also in the culture. I think I think this happens in other religions, from what I've heard as well. But it's predominantly, we're hearing it in a Muslim context today. The value of women is just not on par with men, and it hasn't. They haven't had the rule of law like we've had in the Revelation, the Judeo-Christian foundation in some of these countries as well, to kind of underline the legal structure for these women. And so there's much to be done still to encourage these women, to protect these women, to provide for these women, and to speak out on behalf of women who are undergoing this.
Let me ask you this question. Why are men the maintainers of women in Islam?
I think that is a role that that is very much given to the man. It's almost like there are property in a way to the man, as we were talking about the idea of tilth earlier. The field that a man plows is the idea that man is superior. When I look biblically speaking, theologically speaking, just at the role that we have in contrast with Christianity and Islam, I see the beautiful submission and complementary role of the members of the Trinity. What I understand about Allah is that He's the ruler, men and women are His slaves, and I see the man kind of performing that function, if you will, almost being a reflection of Allah to His family. He's the one to which the wife must submit. And I think that, through the example of Muhammad, through the legal system developed in the Sunnah and the Hadiths and the legal interpretations, that this is embedded into Islamic law, Islamic culture.
David, does the Quran say that men are the maintainers of women?
Yes, it does. It does. In Surah 4, I believe, Surah 4.
David Wood into this conversation. David, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, well, chapter 4, verse 34, of course, that men are the maintainers of women, and that does tie into the previous issue of honor killings. And as it was pointed out, that you can have honor killings among other religions. There are Hindus who do honor killings as well, and some other groups, some non-Muslim groups in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Pakistan. But as was also pointed out, it's predominant among Muslims. And a study was done that over 90% of honor killings worldwide are carried out by Muslims. And the reason for that is as was pointed out as well, that this is a cultural thing. The practice predates Islam. The problem is it's much easier to justify and to defend the practice in Islam than in other systems. So, for instance, Christianity. So what you have is, and basically, three Islamic teachings come together, apart from the issue of the attitude towards women. But basically, why this continues and why this thrives in the Muslim world where it doesn't in the rest of the world is, on the one hand, according to chapter 4, verse 65 of the Quran, various hadith passages, Allah demands complete submission to the teachings of Allah and to the teachings of Muhammad. Abu Bakr, after Muhammad died and he launched what are called the apostate wars, said that if people didn't give a piece of rope that they used to give to Muhammad, he's coming to kill them. So think about this. I mean, diverging from core Islamic practice to such a small extent that you're not giving a piece of rope that you used to give to Muhammad, that's enough to come and kill you. And what this means is it's very easy to point a finger at anyone in Islam and saying, you're not doing this little thing that you're supposed to do, and now I can come and kill you for it. So one, and by the way, his basis for that was, you're apostates, right? If you're not really doing what Islam says, you're not doing what chapter 4, verse 65 says, which you have to completely obey Allah and Muhammad, or you're not a real Muslim. I could put you in the apostate category and come kill you. And so the result was an atmosphere of fear and intimidation where you are scared to death that at any point for abandoning some core Islamic practice, someone's going to come kill you. So those are two things. One, you can be put in the apostate category for all kinds of things. Two, the penalty for apostasy is death. Now, normally in the West we think of apostasy as I'm leaving Islam that's not exactly how it's viewed in Islam. Again, chapter 4, verse 65, you have no real faith until you submit fully to the decisions of Allah and Muhammad. You have no real faith. You're not a real Muslim. And so you put that together. One, you can point a finger at almost anyone, say you're not fully submitting to Muhammad or Allah, therefore you have no real faith. You're not a real Muslim. The penalty is death. And third, in Sunan ibn Majah, Muhammad says, carry out Allah's penalties even against your own family members. Carry out Allah's penalties even against your own family members. So none of this is a direct command to go out and kill girls for wearing miniskirts or walking down the street with a boy or something like this. But where you had that cultural practice already, and then Islam comes on the scene, wait a minute, if my daughter is disobeying, and that is reflecting on my family, guess what? She's disobeying Allah, the penalty is death, and I'm supposed to carry out the penalty against my own family members. Becomes very easy to justify, and I think that's why this practice has flourished in Islam and nowhere else. And so that, by the way, all of that ties in, those three principles in general tie into why it's very easy to kill someone in the Muslim world for all kinds of reasons. But when you tie that into men are the maintainers of women, that becomes, when your women are getting out of line, now it's a dishonor to you because you are supposed to be in control of them. And if they're not, well, you might have to handle that. And for people who already had that cultural practice, like in Pakistan, a lot of women are suffering when these cultural practices are now justified by Islam.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our broadcast now, but I would like to ask Beth one final question. We've heard a lot of, some would say, depressing information as far as the treatment of women in Islam. Is there a way forward, Beth? Is there a way that things can change within Islam?
Well, you mean to change within Islam itself? I think there isn't a way forward. I think you have to leave Islam if you want a way forward. Certainly in my studies of modernist and feminist Muslim women, they are trying to reform Islam. In fact, I had a conversation with someone recently, and the gentleman said that Christianity has been able to modernize, but in Islam, they need to modernize like Christianity. And I said to this man, I said, Islam can never modernize. Christianity can modernize. It can go with the times. It can incarnate into any culture because of the fact that we have a relationship with God. We follow the Lord Jesus Christ, and we know that God came to us and he changes us in our cultures where we are at with all our different issues and all our different needs. But in Islam, because it's so external and because it's so rigid and it's so law-based, it's more difficult even than Old Testament law, it seems. And because you have to look a certain way and be a certain way and do the rules a certain way, of course, according to the different factions, especially Sunni and Shia Islam, which of course there are some different practices in both. But according to their laws of those traditions, you have to abide by them. And they are laws that are stuck in the 7th century. They are laws that cannot be adapted to today. And what Islam has done is they have taken us back to before the cross and back to the law, under the law, and they have completely missed that God has actually come to rescue us. So Islam itself cannot modernize. It's interesting. David Cameron, our Prime Minister here in Britain, said recently when he was talking about ISIS and of course Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, all these very radical groups, he said we must get to the root of the problem, and then when we get to the root of the problem and we excise that out, we deal with the root of the problem, then basically his idea is that we won't have ISIS, Boko Haram, etc. And I sat there watching him on the news, and I thought, does he really realize what he is saying? Basically, what he is saying, and he doesn't understand this, but what he is saying is we have to get rid of the Quran. We have to get rid of the life of Muhammad. We have to get rid of the Sirah, his biography, the Hadith, his sayings. And only when you do that will you, one, you actually won't have a religion anymore, but two, the root of the problem is the religion itself. And in fact, some Muslims are beginning to wake up to this. And there's been many a time when I've opened up the Quran, I've let a Muslim read the verses for themselves. First of all, they sometimes accuse me that I've actually written that Quran, which I definitely haven't. Or they say that's not true, I'm lying. So I open up the Quran, I show them these difficult verses, Surah 4:34, Surah 2:222, Surah 33:53, all these different verses. I get them to read it for themselves. And oftentimes they hand the Quran back to me and they tell me they have no comment, because they have suddenly realized the disturbing truths of their religion. Islam is not true, but there are difficult facts about their religion that they have to accept. And actually, the only solution is to leave Islam and is to turn to the Lord Jesus Christ.
David Cameron's view of religion is one that religion is whatever the adherents make of it. And most Muslims would thoroughly reject that idea, as would most Christians. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a wonderful discussion tonight on women in Islam. I want to thank my excellent guest tonight. We've had Beth Grove from London coming in tonight. We appreciate you staying up tonight and being here with us, Beth. My friend Dianna Newman. Thank you, Dianna.
Thanks, Don.
Cindi Suffern, thank you for joining us tonight. And of course, here in this area is also David Wood, who joined us and added some excellent commentary and some excellent information. Thank you, David, for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been discussing women in Islam tonight. We brought a little bit different view. I started off with a quote from an Islamic apologetics website, one of those websites where they attempt to defend the faith, and they explained how wonderful Islam is and how wonderfully it treats women. And we brought some more information, went a little bit deeper, got to the sources themselves, the Quran, the Hadith, the Sirah, Tafsir. We've went through these sources, and we discovered the subject's a little more complex than the way it was described by that Muslim website. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Women in Islam. We do have another show coming up in about 30 minutes on this same network. I pray that you'll consider and please tune in and listen and watch that one. I've been Don Deal of Norm Geisler International Ministries. This has been Women in Islam. Good night, and may God bless you.